The story begins with the narrator as a real animal lover until he snaps and starts abusing them. Hint, there's alcohol involved. A good bloody outbreak story, where the smug protagonist and their witless followers get their just due, is sometimes exactly what the plague doctor ordered. Unreliable narrators who obsess over details and claim to be sane while committing heinous acts tend to be some of the most interesting storytellers. It's officially spooky season. Time for ghosts, goblins, and things that go bump in the night. Hopefully, you'll catch some horror movies while munching on some candy, enjoy a hayride or two, and sip on some apple cider by the fire. All that's great, but no pumpkin season would be complete without a deadly dose of Edgar Allan Poe. Whether this is your first time reading his work or you just want a refresher, here are the top 7 Poe stories for spooky season. Getting buried in a tomb and scraping your way out may scare some people, but if you find it fascinating and also love the setting of a creepy old collapsing house with dark corners and people going slowly mad, then this is truly the right story for you. The Fall of the House of Usher was first published in 1839 in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, then included in the collection Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque in 1840. Poe takes us on a trip with a nameless narrator who arrives at the house of a childhood friend named Roderick Usher. Roderick is suffering from an illness and believes he is connected to the house itself, evidenced by the giant cracks and decaying structure. Roderick's sister Madeline also experiences an odd illness, falling into crazy death-like trances. She eventually dies, and Roderick buries her in the family catacomb. A storm ensues, and Madeline appears, falling on Roderick, and the narrator runs out as the home collapses, ending the line of the Usher family. Revenge may be a dish best served cold, but sometimes turning up the heat on an insufferable enemy can also be rewarding. If you like ironic, well-masterminded revenge stories, then Hop Frog will feed your inner carrier. Hop Frog, originally Hop Frog or the 8-Chained Orangutans, was first published in 1849 in the newspaper The Flag of Our Union. The title character, Hop Frog, is a person with dwarfism, kidnapped from his home country. He becomes the jester of a king who loves practical jokes. His friend and fellow dwarf Geppetta is smacked by the king, which irritates Hop Frog and gets him scheming some retribution for the king and his cabinet. He's able to get all of them dressed as orangutans for a masquerade, and then in front of the king's guests, Hop Frog murders them all by setting their costumes on fire. He then escapes with Geppetta through the ceiling, where presumably they live happily ever after. Scary stories of the occult, possession, and reincarnation are at the top of the list for lots of people. But how did Poe tell a story like that in the 1830s? Were there tarot cards? And curses? Not exactly, but let's just say when some women die in his stories, they don't always leave. If that's your thing, then Ligeia will stay with you for a while. Ligeia was first published in 1838 and shadows a nameless opium-addicted narrator and his beautiful super-witty raven-haired wife, Ligeia. She gets very sick, writes a creepy poem, and quotes lines to Joseph Glanville, which suggests that life is sustainable only through willpower, shortly before meeting her maker. After she dies, the narrator marries the blonde-haired opposite of Ligeia, Lady Rowena. Rowena also gets sick and dies. This is a pattern for Poe. The troubled narrator stays with her body overnight and watches as Rowena slowly comes back from the dead, though she's changed into Ligeia. Since he's an opium addict, it's unclear if it really happened or if he imagined it. A good bloody outbreak story, where the smug protagonist and their witless followers get their just due, is sometimes exactly what the plague doctor ordered. You'll get that in a perfect spine-chilling setting, as well as a visit from pestilence itself in this one of Poe's most memorable stories. As an aside, Poe's wife was dying of tuberculosis when he wrote it, so bloody coughs and pale skin would have been a regular thing in their house. The Masque of the Red Death was originally published in 1842 in Graham's Lady and Gentleman's Magazine as The Masque of the Red Death, a Fantasy. The story, follows the rich Prince Prospero's attempts to avoid a perilous plague known as the Red Death by hiding in his abbey. Although he, along with many other rich nobles, hosts a masquerade ball in 7 rooms of the abbey, each decorated with a different color. In the 7th room, which is decorated in black, stands a tall, ebony clock that chimes out the hours. Most of the guests avoid this room. At midnight, the clock chimes and a mysterious figure, cloaked as a victim of the Red Death, enters and walks through each of the rooms. Prospero dies after confronting this stranger, whose costume is found to have no form inside it. Everyone dies from the Red Death. Alcoholism makes people do crappy and shameful things. Sometimes those things can make for a messed up but fascinating story, especially when there's an element of the supernatural thrown in. Poe does this brilliantly with this as one of his goriest stories. In this story, what happens in the basement doesn't stay in the basement. The Black Cat was first published in the August 19, 1843 edition of the Saturday Evening Post. In this macabre masterpiece, another nameless narrator has a starring role. The story begins with the narrator as a real animal lover until he snaps and starts abusing them. Hint, there's alcohol involved. One of his favorites, a pet black cat, bites him one night and the narrator reacts by cutting his eye out and then hanging him from a tree. The house then burns down, but one remaining wall displays the outline of a cat hanging from a noose. He soon finds another black cat, similar to the first, except for curious-looking white fur on its chest. He acquires a hatred for the furball and attempts to kill it with his axe, but his wife stops him, so he murders her instead. The narrator walls up her body in the basement in a fake chimney. The cops show up soon after, and while in the basement, a shrieking sound comes from the wall. The cops investigate and find the corpse and also the black cat that has been accidentally walled in with the wife. This is a story you will never forget. Perhaps Poe's most famous revenge story is one that plays out in a damp, crusty catacomb with a drunk, obnoxious, jingling gesture being enclosed live in a space and left to die. If that's your thing, you want to pick up the Cask of Amontillado. Arguably Poe's most read and taught story, this one will leave you shook and with a lingering curiosity when you pass by a cemetery or a brick wall. When you're done reading it, make certain to watch our Emmy Award-winning film and our breakdown videos on the real-life rivalry Poe had with another author. The Cask of Amontillado was first published in the November 1846 issue of Godey's Lady's Book, which was the most popular periodical in America at the time. The story is set in an anonymous Italian city at carnival time. A man by the name of Montresor guiltlessly recounts his story of revenge on a friend he believes insulted him big time. Like several of Poe's stories, and in keeping with the 19th century interest with the subject, the narrative describes the process of the live entombment of Fortunato by Montresor in his dank, dripping catacombs, all under the guise of a hunt for a cask of Amontillado, a tasty sherry. Since it takes place during Carnival, both men are in costumes, with Fortunato already drunk and dressed as a court jester, right down to the cap and bells. No specific is given as an example for how Montresor was wrong, and it's up to the reader to decide. Unreliable narrators who obsess over details and claim to be sane while committing heinous acts tend to be some of the most interesting storytellers. Hannibal Lecter might be one of the most famous of those pop culture icons, along with real-life killers like John Wayne Gacy. If you are partial to these characters and story beats, then this story will be the one you don't want to miss. When you finish reading it, check out our award-winning, heart-stopping short film version and our tie-in videos dissecting the story. The Telltale Heart was first published in James Russell Lowell's The Pioneer in January of 1843. This is another of Poe's stories told by an unnamed narrator, who attempts to convince the reader of their sanity while simultaneously describing a murder they committed. The victim in the story is an old man with a filmy pale blue vulture eye. The narrator highlights the careful calculation of the murder, attempting the perfect crime, complete with dismembering the body in the bathtub and hiding it under the floorboards. Ultimately, the narrator's actions result in hearing a thumping sound, which the narrator interprets as the dead man's beating heart. The Telltale Heart is often a classic of Gothic fiction and is one of Poe's best-known short stories. It's widely read and taught, and its themes are pervasive in countless other stories and films. So this Halloween, or any time of year, when you need to have a good scare or a taste of dramatic irony, now you know which Poe stories to read first. There are many more good ones the guy wrote, but these just happen to be our favorites. Now go, read something scary.